Not long ago, I did a video on the Corvega factory in the Capital Wasteland. You can watch that video here. But when we exit the building and look south, we find a ledge overlooking the ruins of downtown DC. In the ruins of one skyscraper, we find Talon Company waiting for us.
You're dead! That's it!
After mopping up Talon Company, if we again head due south, we find a road running east to west in the shadow of imposing pre-war sculptures. If we look east on the road, we find a super mutant that had recently won a battle with a sentry bot. This battle took place close to a blue and yellow truck. In the back of the truck, we find a few ammunition canisters. Back out on the road, if we continue east, we find a more or less intact overpass. The middle is about to cave in, but what's more interesting about this site is we see a door beneath the overpass. This is an unmarked location, and outside the door, we see a sign, Fallout Shelter. Approaching the door, we can enter the shelter. We arrive at the top of a utility staircase, and immediately to the right, we see an interesting scene. Someone has put great pains into erecting this little sculpture. We find a tin can balancing on top of a Nuka-Cola, balancing on top of a mug, which is balancing on top of a book, which is balancing on top of pencils, on top of a chessboard. If we fiddle with it, we destroy it, but we can loot the Nuka-Cola. Heading down the stairs, we again find a strange sight. But before we can explore it, we awaken a ghoul. With the ghoul dead, we can head back. It's the head of a statue, and it looks an awful lot like one of those statues we found within the Hall of Columns inside the Capitol building. But if it is, how on earth could it have gotten here? This ruined head appears to be larger than the door that leads here. There's a pre-war American flag, a banner, a ruined toilet, and a bunch of plungers. Continuing on our way, we head down a staircase. We find a nook to the left with a refrigerator filled with human skulls. Continuing on our way, we pass another plunger to creep into a bloody room. And this isn't just any bloody room. It's the Plunger Room of Death. We see blood spatter all over the ground, and to the right we see bloody handprints leading up the wall and, oh my goodness, all the way to the ceiling. What? How did those bloody handprints get on the ceiling? There's a puddle of blood on the ceiling and plungers stuck to the wall, forming a trail all the way up there. I toggled clipping to follow this trail, and it ends on the ceiling, in a puddle of blood. The handprints don't go anywhere else. There's nothing else here. Back on the ground, we see a skeleton by a dose of jet, surrounded by plungers. There's a stretcher nearby with a motorcycle helmet covered in plungers, and above it is even more blood spatter and handprints. There's a generator with a plunger, a filing cabinet covered in plungers. There's a plunger on the chemistry station, a plunger against the wall, and a mannequin with a plunger on her head holding another plunger. Oh. Did this mannequin murder the man whose skeleton we find in the corner with, God help him, a plunger? Sadly, this Plunger Room of Death only raises questions and gives us no answers. How did the head of the statue get down here? Why is this blood still bright red and fresh? How are the plungers sticking to cement walls and ceilings? And why? God, why? Sadly, we may never know. And so we can leave this unmarked shelter and bid farewell to the Plunger Room of Death. But you know, this is not the last time we will find such an insidious scene with plungers. Bethesda made a reference to the Plunger Room of Death in Fallout 4. I cover the warehouse Plumber's Secret in my video on Watts Consumer Electronics that you can watch here. What are your thoughts about this perplexing scene? How do you describe what we found here? Sure, we could always just say it's some developer having fun, but we're interested in the lore, and if we find it in the world, there has to be a logical explanation for it. so I'll give it a go. One day, a bunch of raiders went to the Capitol building and hacked off the head of one of the statues in the Hall of Columns. Somehow, without automobiles or cranes, they managed to carry this thing in a shopping cart all the way to this unmarked shelter, whereupon they again magically squeezed it through the door to put it on display in their lovely raider home. They began to set up shop, decorate it with chems and mattresses, and they found a stock of pre-war plungers. But what were so many plungers doing in a utility room beneath an overpass? This question perplexed the raiders, and it gnawed at one of them, until one day, after contemplating it for months, he went crazy, and he killed the other raider in a frenzied melee using nothing but plungers as weapons. At last, he found meaning in these plungers. They were his tools. The blood of his friend was his medium, and this shelter was his canvas. And so he set to work, making the most gruesome self-portrait imaginable, activating his hover powers to hover in the air and place all of those handprints on the wall and ceiling. When he was done painting in blood and sticking plungers to every surface imaginable, he left the shelter and still roams the wasteland to this day. There you go. That's the best I could do. I'd love to see how you interpret what we find here. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. 'Tis the season, and I'm away from the office for a while, so I whipped up a bunch of these Fallout minisodes to tide you over until I get back. If interested in my shirts, you can find a link to my shirt shop in the description below or by clicking here. If you like what I do and you want to support me in a more personal way, consider becoming one of my patrons on Patreon or a member here on YouTube. But more than anything, I'm just so glad you're here watching this video with me today. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope you all have happy holidays.